Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Pursuing Private Foundation and Corporate Grant Opportunities in Life Science Research. Our presenter today is Dr. Devon Brewer, editor, writer, scientific advisor, and statistical consultant. My name is Christy Jewell of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is brought to you by LabRoots and is sponsored by Leica Microsystems. For more information on our sponsor, please visit leica-microsystems.com. Okay, now let's get started. I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive, and we encourage you to participate by submitting as many questions as you like at any time you want during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box, and someone will be able to help you out. Devon will be answering a portion of these questions live following the presentation, and any of these questions that we don't answer live will receive a written response via the email address that was provided at the time of registration. You will also see multiple tabs at the top of your screen. If you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, click on that support tab, or you can report your problem by using the Ask a Question box. You can also share this webinar on your personal social media. Just click on the social sharing tab and let your friends and colleagues know about today's live event. Additionally, this presentation is educational and thus offers continuing education credits. At the end of the viewing of this presentation, just click on the Continuing Education Credits tab and follow the process to obtain your credits. I'd now like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Devon Brewer. Dr. Brewer is an editor, writer, scientific advisor, and statistical consultant. He has 25 years of experience in writing successful grant proposals in the health sciences. He has been a principal investigator on several grants and a key contributor to many others. Dr. Brewer has written funded proposals and or reviewed proposals for NIH, NSF, CDC, HRSA, and MRC UK, private foundations, and other agencies. As a scientific advisor and writer with Science Docs, he helps researchers develop and compose effective proposals and manuscripts. You may view Dr. Brewer's biography in the Biography tab at the top of your screen. Dr. Brewer, you may now begin your presentation.
Hi, I'm going to talk about pursuing private foundation and corporate research grant opportunities. The information I give applies to North America, but much of what I describe may be relevant to other parts of the world too. Because I will give advice about how to about how to find and apply for foundation and corporate research grants, let me tell you a little bit about my experience. For over 26 years, I have written successful grant proposals in the health sciences. I have been the principal investigator on several grants and a key contributor to many others. I have written funded proposals or reviewed proposals for many national government funding agencies in the United States and United Kingdom, as well as for private foundations and other organizations. As a scientific advisor and writer with Science Docs, I help researchers develop and compose effective manuscripts and proposals, including to private foundations and corporations. I'll begin this tour today with a little background on private foundation and corporate grants. Next, I will describe some reasons why researchers pursue such funding and essential matters to consider before doing so. Then I will review how to find information about foundation and corporate research grant opportunities, and discuss some common procedures and approaches for applying. At the end, I'll highlight some best practices to follow when developing a research grant proposal of any kind. There are approximately 90,000 private foundations in the United States. many private foundations give grants for charitable purposes. Their funds come from an individual, family, corporation, or another group. These individuals and groups often run their foundations personally or are closely involved. In Canada, there are about 3,000 grant-making foundations. Many corporations also give to charitable causes directly. Although often not legally classified as foundations, many disease-specific, non-profitable charitable organizations also give research grants. For the purposes of this webinar, I categorize such charities as foundations. Research is just one of many kinds of activities that a foundation or corporation may support. Most foundation and corporate grants are for nonprofit organizations only. This means that universities and colleges are eligible for a foundation or corporate grant, but individuals and for-profit businesses typically are not. However, sometimes a foundation or corporation holds a challenge type of contest related to a specific problem, seeking proposals from any individual or kind of organization. The X Prize Foundation is an example of this. Foundation and corporate grants differ from government agency grants in several key ways. Research grants given by foundations and corporations tend to be smaller than those given by government agencies. Foundations and corporations also tend to focus more on applied research and translation to practical uses than do government funding agencies. In addition, compared to government agency research grants, foundation and corporate grants may have fewer bureaucratic requirements for grantees. Furthermore, foundation and corporate grants also tend not to include much or any support for indirect costs, also known as overhead or infrastructure charges. Because they fund many kinds of activities, foundations and corporations usually have less experience with research and researchers than government agencies that fund research. Foundations and corporations tend to have less standardized proposal formats, and proposal reviewers might not include any scientists. Scientific merit might be only one of several factors in their funding decisions. Why might you want to seek funding from private foundations and corporations? One reason might be to avoid the ever-increasing complexity and number of forms in applying for government funding. Most foundations and corporations have quite simple application processes in comparison. Private foundations probably offer many more fellowship opportunities as well as awards based on an individual investigator's record and promise than do government research agencies. Funding that is not project-based can give you intellectual and scientific freedom to do the research you think is most important, rather than what biased, timid, or unimaginative peers prioritize. Of course, a natural reason to seek foundation and corporate support for your research is that you cannot obtain it from government or other sources. Also, foundations and corporations are much more likely to fund unusual projects, those that are truly innovative, unconventional, or risky, than government agencies. Foundations and corporations may be less bound to disciplinary short-sightedness and the political struggles among academics. Moreover, foundation and corporate funding may be necessary, even with government support, for especially large projects that no one sponsor can afford on its own. Before seeking a foundation or corporate research grant, you should consider several matters first. You might need to reduce the size of your project or break it into smaller, independent pieces to get support from foundations and corporations. Foundations and corporations often want to have an identifiable project or part of a project that is theirs, that is, one that they alone support. Private funders tend to have less money to give, so lean budgets are essential. Although some foundations do support basic research, it is important to present your plans as having a clear connection to real-world concerns, rather than simply academic goals. Foundations and corporations generally want research focused on practical problems. You should check with administrators in your organization before seeking a foundation or corporate grant. Some research organizations will not accept grants that do not cover indirect costs or some amount of them. It is more difficult to find research grant opportunities from private foundations and corporations than it is from government funding agencies. However, with some time and effort, you can use a few basic strategies and resources to find potential private funders. Ask colleagues and peers who do research similar to your own what private sources of funding they have received for their work. You can also identify other private funders by reading acknowledgement sections of articles in your area of research. You can find many possibly relevant private foundations and corporations by searching the World Wide Web. Most private funders of life science research focus on particular human diseases. So, an example set of search terms might be the name of the disease, and research, and charity. You could also repeat the search, but replace charity with foundation, and then search again by replacing it with grant. If your topic isn't related to a disease, you can try using the name of your subject instead of the name of a disease. Google Scholar is an excellent additional resource. It indexes the full text of the published scientific literature, including the acknowledgement sections in articles. So, an example search of Google Scholar might include the name of a disease, and grant, and foundation, but not the phrase National Science Foundation. The format shown here is the syntax necessary to do this in Google Scholar. Check with your institution's Grants and Contracts Office about potential non-government funders for your research. If your institution has a foundation and corporate funding office, check there too. Often these offices receive news about new funding opportunities and share it with researchers. Sometimes funders limit the number of applications they will allow from each institution, especially for individual-based awards rather than project-based grants. Administrators in these offices can guide you on these matters. There are several commercial subscription services that compile information on research grant opportunities and research funders, including private foundations and corporations. Some of the most popular services include Grant Domain, Grant Forward, Pivot, and Research Professional. Many of these services are international, covering opportunities for researchers in different countries. Other services give you access to the databases or to databases on private foundations with some information on their past grant-making activity. The Foundation Center covers the United States, and Grant Connect covers Canada. Such databases can help you identify the many foundations, especially smaller ones, that don't promote their grant opportunities. Your institution's Grants and Contracts Office, Foundation and Corporate Funding Office, or library may subscribe to one or more of these services, or a nearby university might also subscribe if your own institution doesn't have any subscriptions. There are also free directories that are generally less comprehensive or detailed, but still can help you find potential suitable funders. I give a small sample here of what exists. For instance, the National Organization of Rare Diseases lists hundreds of patient-led rare disease organizations, most of which fund research. The Philanthropy News Digest has a searchable database on all currently active requests for proposals it has received from foundations. Proposal Central also shows open research grant opportunities, mostly from private funders. Wells Fargo Bank shows information on all the foundations for which it provides administrative and other support. And Charity Durr has a searchable database on all grant-making foundations in Canada. Once you have identified potential funders, prioritize them in terms of how well their past grants and interest profile fits with your work. Target those that match best. There are several useful approaches to applying for grants from foundations and corporations. First, discuss your project ideas with a representative of the funder to gauge their interest and possible ways of presenting your proposal to them. However, often there is no one available at the foundation or corporation who might discuss grant ideas with you or give you further insight to the funder's priorities and inclinations. So instead, you could try to find past grantees and ask them for their impressions of the funder's orientation and preferences. Foundations and corporations usually ask that potential applicants first submit a letter of intent or a letter of interest. Funders review the letters and then invite full proposals from those grant seekers in whom they are most interested. If there are no instructions for the content and format of a letter, summarize your planned project briefly, in a page or two, in layman's terms. Typically, it is also necessary to write proposals for a lay audience, as reviewers and/or decision makers at the funder may include few scientists or few scientists in your specialty. This means no jargon or very limited jargon that you define well, no or very limited acronyms, and no complex sentence structures. Scientists tend to struggle with such requirements, So plan to spend a lot of time to craft your proposal in a simple, concise, and clear way. Proposal requirements vary widely across private funders. Unless a funder has instructed otherwise, include all of the elements that appear in a government agency proposal, such as a description of the problem you intend to address, how your project might advance the state of knowledge and why it is important, details on what you plan to do, problems that might occur in the project and how you anticipate handling them, your own background and expertise, and that of your team if it is a group effort. That is, why are you qualified to do the project? Other relevant research that has been done before, and what is new or different about your project. Why you are seeking support from this funder and not more common sources, such as a government agency. A justification of your budgeted expenses. A project schedule that lists what you will deliver to the funder in return for its support. A list of references cited, and an abstract or overall proposal summary. Finally, it is crucial that you tailor your letter and proposal to each funder. Highlight how your project focuses on the funder's priorities and goals. In effect, you are a vendor selling a project, and the funder is your customer. Demonstrate how your project will meet your customer's needs and desires. Improve your chances of getting funded by following best practices for developing a grant proposal, regardless of funder. Set aside several months to develop and prepare your proposal. Work closely with administrators at your institution and involve them early in the process to avoid having problems later. Follow all application instructions the funder gives precisely. Learn how to write an effective proposal to private funders by studying colleagues or others' successful proposals to foundations and corporations. Lastly, get critical feedback on your proposal from colleagues and revise accordingly before submission. I discuss these and other essentials at length in another video at the link shown here, is.gd/grant13. There are also other resources you can draw on. At Science Docs, we help researchers in all phases of developing and writing grant proposals and manuscripts. We have experts in every specialty ready to assist. You can learn more at sciencedocs.com. Okay, I'd like to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Brewer, for your informative presentation. We will now start the live Q&A portion of our webinar. If you have a question you would like to ask, please do so now. Just click on that Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen, and we will answer as many of your questions as we have time for. Okay, we've got some great questions already coming in. Dr. Brewer, let's start with this one. Is already having grants from government agencies for other projects a good reason for applying for foundational grants?
Well, I don't think it really makes a difference one way or the other. I don't think a foundation would discriminate against a grant seeker that already has grants from government agencies for other projects. And it might actually help that grant seeker to have that kind of background. But either way, I don't think it makes a huge difference.
Thank you, Dr. Brewer. Our next question, where can I find a non-foundation disease-specific charities list?
Well, most of the disease-specific charities, whether they're legally they're classified as a foundation or not, often doesn't really make a difference from the grant seeker's perspective, because they both foundation charities and non-foundation charities frequently offer grants. But in terms of finding all those opportunities, from the slides I presented about how to search to identify these kinds of foundation and other charitable funders, and the lists like the National Organization for Rare Diseases has hundreds of disease-specific charities for rare diseases.
Dr. Brewer, we have a question that comes in. I am a scientist, staff, not faculty. Am I qualified to apply for a grant?
From the perspective of a foundation or a corporation, very likely yes. The key question usually, though, is whether your institution, your organization will accept having you be the principal investigator on a grant. Sometimes if they don't allow that, you might be able to find a faculty person that will serve as the principal investigator, at least in name only, where you actually do all the preparatory work in developing the proposal and doing all that, and maybe even executing all the work if it were to get funded. So usually there's an administrative workaround at most institutions to handle that situation.
Dr. Brewer, is there a source of funds for-profit organizations?
So, most private foundations and charities don't, or either don't or cannot give grants to private individuals or private companies or firms. There are a few exceptions. Like I mentioned, the X Prize Foundation and similar kinds of opportunities that are often presented as challenges, where the funder wants a solution to a particular problem or a class of problems and seeks innovative responses to that problem. And oftentimes those kinds of opportunities do not restrict the grantees to be nonprofit or academic organizations. So those are the kinds of opportunities that are best for private firms.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Brewer, what is the average success rate for private foundation or corporate grants?
There's no way really to say. I mean, number one, most foundations and corporations don't offer any statistics on their funding rates. But even more important than that is that there's it's a very diverse set of funders. You're talking about thousands of, in just North America alone, thousands of foundations and corporations that give grants, and so they're very different from each other. So it's very difficult to say. What I can say is that there are quite a few researchers that do obtain funding from these sources, and so that that would at least suggest that the funding rates are high enough to make pursuing them worthwhile.
Thank you, Dr. Brewer. Now we have a question coming in asking if this webinar is available for review, and yes it is. This webcast can be viewed on demand following our live presentation, and LabRoots will alert you via email when it is available for replay. And I also want to make note that you can continue to submit questions during that on-demand period, and Dr. Brewer will answer those questions via the email address you provided at your time of registration. So let's continue with our questions. Dr. Brewer, are there any styles of proposals that appeal to NGOs rather than GOs? And what areas of my proposal should I emphasize more than others?
Okay, let me find this question again. So that appeal to NGOs, so I assume for NGOs here, I assume the questioner is asking about NGOs, meaning foundation or charitable funders. In terms of the style of the proposal is going to vary, again, dramatically depending on the particular funder. So you just have to study all the information available about what their expectations are for a proposal, and do your background research, try to find other people that have been funded by this organization, and ask them for advice or just tips on how to present your ideas. What areas of my proposal should I emphasize more than others? Again, that's just going to vary, depend upon the particular funder. But in general, compared to government agency proposals, the clear emphasis for most private foundations and corporations is for something that has a tangible, practical, applied benefit, and not just mere building of knowledge or advancing science. That there's got to be generally they want to see some sort of movement toward practical payoff. So that's something that many researchers struggle with, even if their work is applied, to be able to communicate their mission and how exactly their scientific research is going to relate to these real-world concerns.
Thank you, Dr. Brewer. Moving on to our next question. Do the databases you mentioned provide information on corporate funding sources? And is there a difference between getting funding from corporate sources versus a foundation?
So the corporate funding sources are probably they're definitely more difficult to identify. A few of them a few of the sources that I mentioned do make reference to corporations that give grants, but most of them most corporations that give grants you'll probably identify through doing the web searches and the searches on Google Scholar. And also just your own personal or your colleagues' personal connections. That's also, a very limited way to identify opportunities, but a good one. If your network of associates happen to have connections to such firms. Is there a difference between getting funding from corporate sources versus a foundation? Well, there's, again, that's going to vary based upon the particular corporation or foundation. corporate grants, they are, if they're probably less familiar with the machinery of academic and research institutions. So the idea of indirect costs may be completely foreign to them, and so you might not be able to get indirect costs at all from many corporate grant sources. Whereas some foundations are at least familiar with the concept and may pay a token indirect cost rate. But again, the details of whether it's better to get one from one source or another, that just depends upon the particular funder. But in terms of your purposes, if you get funding for a project, money is money, and it still would allow you to do what you want to do.
Thank you, Dr. Brewer. Our next question, do you feel that NGOs in the U.S. are better aligned to support international research projects than their counterparts in ex-U.S.?
Wow, that's a good question. I don't have much experience with their counterparts in terms of being funders of research outside of the United States. I would guess that for funders in the English-speaking world outside of the United States and in Western Europe, that they would be generally similar. But again, I can't say based upon my experience. I do get the impression that particularly in Europe, the bureaucratic requirements for funding tend to be much higher, at least in government grants, compared to grants in the United States.
Dr. Brewer, will corporate grants have restrictions on some research activities, for example, publishing?
That would depend upon the particular funder, but for most corporate research grants, they're grants, not partnerships or contracts. So I'm just talking about grants. And so grants usually don't come with those kinds of restrictions because the corporate research grants are typically coming out of the charitable efforts, the charitable wing of a corporation, and not the main line of that corporation's business.
Where can I find grants for equipment?
Well, that's a difficult question. It depends upon what the purpose of the equipment is. Again, if you would have to align your interest in the equipment to the goals of the funder. But I am not aware of any foundations or corporations that just give grants or have an interest in giving grants to support purchasing of equipment generically by researchers.
Dr. Brewer, are there any foundations or sources that fund equipment, and I guess we're piggybacking on that previous question, any foundations or sources that fund equipment or lab development grants?
There may be. I can't think of any right off the top of my head. There are grants that are focused on individuals and developing individuals, sometimes young investigators or new investigators, and sometimes more senior ones. And those are grants that are, or they may even be called a fellowship, or they may come under different names, different labels. But there are many competitive fellowship and grants to grants awarded to individual researchers, and in those cases, I would imagine that many of or much of the funds could be used to develop one's lab.
Dr. Brewer, can postdocs seek a private foundation grant?
This is similar to a prior question. So from the perspective of the funder, usually the status of or the position of a researcher within their institution usually isn't a critical matter. It's not something that they would discriminate against and restrict to one class of employee or faculty than another. The key issue is whether your institution, your organization will let you apply as a principal investigator on a grant. And if you're not able to do that, usually there's a way to arrange someone who is eligible to apply within your organization and to work with them, and they might be more of a nominal principal investigator where you would do the work, but institutionally you would not be the project leader.
Dr. Brewer, do these foundations also fund training?
Yes, many foundations do support training generically. If you're referring to like a training grant, to support, say, postdocs or clinical fellows or something of that nature, then those particular kinds of things. There are more limited opportunities. But if you were to have something, if you were talking about training, like to conduct a workshop to train researchers in some important technique or some important approach, there might be more interest in that, if you can connect it to the funder's missions.
Dr. Brewer, what is the best route for a holder of a provisional patent that needs funding fairly quickly, and they would need 10 to 100 million?
So that's usually way beyond the scope of what a private foundation or corporate grant would be able to support. As I mentioned before, private firms and companies are usually not eligible to receive corporate grants and private foundation grants. So that's more in the venture capital, startup funding, commercial startup funding space, as opposed to the private foundation and corporate grant space.
Thank you, Dr. Brewer. And we have time for just one or two more. What about funding by sovereign funds?
I don't have any experience with funding from sovereign funds, and I would imagine, so I really can't answer that.
And Dr. Brewer, let's wrap with this final question. For a private company, do you have an estimate for percentage effort or range for the PI that they would view as acceptable? I have several awards through this route, and this is always a battle.
And this is for, let me just find this question again. I'm sorry. For a private company, again, it's going to be the number of opportunities for funding from a private foundation or corporation are going to be very limited, and they're going to tend to be these types of challenge efforts where, so in those cases where you're responding to some kind of X Prize or related kind of challenge, oftentimes they're not funding, the details of who does what and percentage of time. Those kinds of things tend not to be material factors in those kinds of competitions.
Thank you, Dr. Brewer. And I'm going to squeeze in one last question. What about SBIR grants for startups?
Those are great for startups. SBIRs are government grants in the United States, for example, from NIH or NSF or CDC. So that's another ball game. That's the government side. Today I'm just talking about private foundations and corporations.
Dr. Brewer, thank you so much for your time today. I would also like to thank LabRoots and our sponsor, Leica Microsystems, for underwriting today's educational webcast. Before we go, I would like to thank the audience for joining us and for their interesting questions. We had quite a few questions we were not able to answer, and we know that you can continue to submit questions during the on-demand period. So those questions will be answered via the email address you provided at the time of registration. This webcast can be viewed on demand, and LabRoots will alert you via email today when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. That's all for now, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a great day.